Hello everyone, this here is the chapter 8 video. We will see if this works. We had trouble with chapter 6 last week, so I'm going to give it another shot, see what for your test over the 4 chapters. Let me get one up real quick. Go ahead while I'm getting this done, go ahead and get your PowerPoint up. And that way, as I'm going through, once we get to that point, as I'm going through that, you will have all that information handy at that point in time. So, okay. So I'm actually going to drop the discussion board from chapter 8. I wanted to double check that. So hopefully start getting some observations and things completed. So for chapter 8, you'll read the chapter, complete your quiz, and then study for the tests over the 4 chapters. So you do have chapter 7 this week too. I'll discuss that. I'll do that Sunday morning. So we're going to go and get started with this part here. So let's go ahead and go to slide. Has this week's homework again. You'll have 7 quiz, 7 discussion board. IEP over autism. We'll discuss that. It's due Sunday night, but we will discuss in class on Tuesday, which you should have already had that by now. Autism paper due the 24th, and then chapter 8 quiz on that one there. So anyway, that's what we're going to work on. So let's go ahead and get started. First of all, I want you to watch the video, the YouTube video on communication. So go ahead and pause this and go ahead and click your slide to watch the communication video. Okay. Hopefully that helped you have a better understanding of communication and how we will look at it as a disability for our students. Just a little review there on the first couple slides. Please go ahead and look through those, some reviews over autism spectrum disorder. So you can kind of go through those and write down your answers. Chapter 8 from last year, like I said, I went ahead and left these on here to give you a better idea of some of the questions that students had last year. So that's what the next slides are, and then we will actually get into Chapter 8 PowerPoints. Chapter 8 I'll go through fairly quickly because and questions. The chapter objectives identify and provide examples of 4 major functions of communication. Describe the characteristics of each. And you have speech and sound errors, fluency disorders, voice disorders, and language disorders. So you need to know those 4 and explain why receive services under speech or language impairment. And we'll talk about that too. Then describe identify causes and primary types of speech and language impairments. List the major components of a comprehensive evaluation, and we'll actually go through that. Identify the basic goals and common elements, and then explain how the speech and language pathologist's role changes as a function. Next slide talks about definitions. It is the interactive exchange of information, ideas, feelings, needs, and desires. You need to know what communication involves, so make sure you know those functions and those the message code that a group of people use. You will want to look at, you'll see phonology and syntax are listed in red. You'll need to go ahead and look over those. But you'll also need to know morphology, semantics, and pragmatics. You'll need to know a basic definition of those. And also dialects are the learned patterns of speech and language appropriate to families and communities. I know you may not think of dialects being that much of a difference, but I know we had a student in Warrensburg that came to us from a southern state, and in probably an area that was more rural, and so the speech The dialect came into play because of teachers not being able to understand the student. And we really had a challenge on our hands with the IEP team because it was not per se that he couldn't do the speech sounds. It was more the fact that the dialect or the culture, the background in his speech was not as understandable to the teachers and things in this area. Kind of similar to me, we went to New Orleans a while back, and the Cajun-speaking people of New Orleans, yes, it's English, but being able to understand them is a different indeed. So we had to decide as a team with this student is whether it was a speech problem or whether that he was a student with a speech disability or not. We finally, since it was in high school, we were looking at transition. This student wanted to go into acting and things like that. So we did feel like it was kind of on the border, but we did go ahead and make the student eligible as a student with a speech disorder and work with him to help him better just because of his dialect. But it does come into play. Language includes not only sounds, but also letters and elements of sign language. So make sure that as you're looking at this, you realize that it's not just speech. It's ways of communication. Speech, the oral production of language. And then it talks about the sounds are product of four related processes. Respiration, phonation, resonation, and articulation. You really need to look at articulation. And in the book, read over that a little bit more so that when you get to the test, you have a good understanding of what articulation is. But you'll need to know a basic deal of phonation and resonation also. So kind of to keep your eyes on that one. Then a little spot I want you to kind of take some time to write down. So how do definitions of speech and language impairments relate to one another and the typical language development? I'd like for you to go ahead and pause and go ahead and write down your thoughts. And then we'll go to the next slide that'll have my answer that I found from the book. So if you're done with that, language is a formalized code used by a group of people to communicate with one another. And speech is the oral production of language, fastest and most efficient method of communication by language, also one of the most complex. And that's found on page 260 to 61 if you want to go back and look at that a little further. Typical speech and language development. I'm not going to go through a lot of that, but it would be good to know the ages. And the 30 million word gap is a reference to the vast difference in the number of words that some children from poverty background of here by age 4 compared to those with experience of affluent children. So again, you're kind of looking at environment when you're looking at speech and language to see if the student has been exposed to the language. If they have not been exposed as much to words and to the language, they may have difficulty in this also that you have to look at. Then there's the communication disorders defined. There's the ASHA definition, which is an impairment in the ability to receive, send, process, and comprehend concepts, or verbal, nonverbal, and graphic symbols systems. And then there's the IDEA definition that we'll be working with primarily through our IEPs. A communication disorder such as stuttering, impaired articulation, a language impairment, or a voice impairment that adversely affects the child's educational performance. Many times a student may have autism and some other things, but they also have that stuttering that happens when they get anxious or when they get nervous. And so working with them to help them get over that. I know one student that we talked to, or that we had working through the speech and language pathologist at one point in time, we actually found out that what was going on is the student in his head was going through what he was going to say before he said it. And because he was trying to speak so quickly, he was realizing that he needed to say different words, and that's how it came out as stuttering. So what we worked with that student on is once we found out what was going on, as a speech and language pathologist worked on timing and worked on slowing down his speech and slowing down how fast he spoke so that he could then think in his mind what he wanted to say and get it out. And it did work much better on that one there. When does communication difference become a communication disorder? Because, you know, we're looking at, for an IEP, we're looking at a communication disorder, not a communication difference. And I liked this when I read it the first time. When a communication difference involves the extent of impact on one's life, it becomes a communication disorder. So I thought that was a good part to put in there. Speech is impaired when it deviates so from the speech of other people that it calls attention to itself, interferes with communication, and provokes distress in the speaker or listener. So, you know, you're looking at a speech impairment when you're looking at those. And then you need to look at the three basic types. There's articulation disorders, which is errors in the production of sounds. You have then fluency disorders, which is difficulties in the flow or rhythm of speech. And then also voice disorders with problems with the quality or use of one's tone or one's voice. And so you do need to know about those three different types of speech impairments so that you can understand what they are and realize that there are three in there, because many times I don't think you as a student did not realize that there are differences in that. So keep an eye on that. Language disorder is impaired comprehension and or use of spoken, written, or other symbol systems. It may involve a combination of things, and you do need to look through this and kind of, go over this so you know what each one means, what each one represents. The form of language involves phonology, morphology, and syntax, and those are three terms that you definitely want to look at. We talked about them earlier. The content of language, which is semantics, you need to know what that is. And the function of language, which is pragmatics. You'll hear a lot of times those with those students that have a form of autism, that many times they will work on pragmatics. So this is what that's talking about, the function of language. And language disorders may involve receptive or expressive disorders also. So those are items that you want to look at. The characteristics of speech sound errors: you've got distortions, substitutions, omissions, and additions. You do want to look through your book so you can kind of get an idea, kind of visualize what those four errors are. And then it talks about articulation disorders. A child is not able to produce a given sound physically because that sound is not in his repertoire. So that's why they work on sounds, they work on those, and then work with them. I know when I was younger, with my cleft lip and palate, I had speech up until middle school, and now that I'm talking about it, my sounds are probably a little better. My S's were what I worked on the most, and there was a time where basically they dismissed me because in this setting here, when I'm thinking about it, I was fine with my S's and T's and things like that. But so it just means that I've got to watch how I'm talking, how I'm saying it, and make sure and watch that. So sometimes they may dismiss a student because in the setting of the speech and language pathologist room, or as they're getting in smaller groups, when you're thinking about it, the student may do fine. But then when they get into the outside environments where they don't have to think about it, they sometimes kind of forget about it and don't do as well. It talks about phonological disorders, where the child has the ability to produce a given sound and does so correctly in some instances, but not in others. So it just depends on how the sound is put in the word, whether first, beginning, or last, or in different environments. There's also fluency disorder, is an interruption in the flow of speaking characterized by atypical rate, rhythm, and repetition in sound, syllables, and word phrases. So that's fluency disorder. And there's also voice disorders, which is a phonation disorder caused by the voice to sound breathy or hoarse or husky or strained. So these students too would qualify under speech and language speech as a voice disorder. Resonance disorders result in hypernasality or hyponasality. So just understand what these are so that you can understand them as we're talking about them. Positive reinforcement and confidence building are some of the typically effective treatment for fluency disorders. So the more that the student feels like it's okay, that they're doing well, the more praises they get when the student is doing well, the better off they will be. The more confidence they build, the better they will be. Characteristics of language disorders. Language disorders involve problems in one or more of the 5 dimensions of language. So again, phonology, you need to understand that. Morphology, definitely syntax. Definitely need to look through that in the book and get an idea. Semantics and pragmatics, we discussed a little earlier. Language delay implies a child is slow to develop linguistic skills, but acquires them in a typical sequence. So it's just delayed. They're acquiring them in the right sequence that we would foresee, but they're just a little bit delayed in getting there, so they do understand. Language disorders suggest a disruption in the usual rate and or sequence in which specific language skills emerge. Next, I threw in a question. So again, once I read this, I'd like for you to pause and write down what your thoughts were and then come back. What basic types of communication disorders might make statements such as, the dogs run home and that foop is dude signal? So think about that. The dogs run home. So look in your book and what type of communication disorder do you think that would fall under. And then the next one, that foop is dude. You know, look and see whether you can see what type of disorders they would be. Just take a look in your book, pause, and come back here in a few minutes. Okay. The problems likely signal an error in articulation of speech. However, children's works and sentences often differ from adults' forms while children are learning language. As they progress, children will gradually replace incorrect word and sentence structures. And to learn more, this was on page 276 of your text. Now I want to talk about prevalence. 2012-2013, over 1,356,000 students, 6 to 21, were shown to receive special education under speech or language. It is the second largest disability category under IDEA. Approximately 2/3 of school age served by SLPs are boys. So again, another one where the boys are of a primary disability have communication disorders. So this is why this is actually even smaller. It should be a larger percentage because many students that are classified maybe as autistic or learning disabled or ID or some of these other categories that we've discussed also have a speech. So that's why the percentage of children with speech and language disorders decreases significantly from the early to the later school grades. This is also an area that that school districts are trying to, they will, instead of testing, they will do some work with the students because maybe they are just delayed a little bit and then in a year they're caught up. And so, earlier on they may have a lot more students being served under speech or the later grades. They do tend to drop and be dismissed from special education at that point in time. The next two you can pass on a little bit. I've got them hidden. That one is not, don't want to go over those at this point. Causes. Cleft palate is a cause of speech impairment, paralysis of the speech muscles, absence of teeth, craniofacial abnormality, possible causes of those speech impairments. And you probably be good just to look over to know what some of the causes are as you get to the test. The causes of language disorders also developmental and intellectual disabilities, autism, TBI again, child abuse and neglect can be a cause. Hearing loss, structural abnormalities of the speech mechanism also, as we were talking about that earlier, can be a possibility. Let's do another question. So go ahead, I'll read the question and then go ahead and pause it and then come back to me. What are the major components of a comprehensive evaluation to detect the presence and extent of a communication disorder? So go ahead and pause and write down what you think. Well, the first line of assessment involved universal screening and teacher observations. Normally the teacher is one of the first ones to see this in the classroom. She will then mention to the speech and language pathologist that she has a student she'd like for her to come watch and observe. And once they observe, if the speech and language pathologist thinks that there might be a possibility of contact the parents and set up for an evaluation to see whether they would qualify. If a child is suspected of having a communication disorder, the SLP will conduct more systematic tests. But at that point, before they would do those tests, they would definitely contact the parent, set up a referral meeting to have parents sign off on tests and make sure that they have plenty of time. Identification, screening, and teacher observations. You're going to have evaluation components that include some, if not all, of the following ideas: case history and physical examination, articulation, hearing, phonological awareness and processing, vocabulary and overall language development, assessment of language function, language samples, and observation in natural settings component. Sorry if you're hearing my dog. He's in dreamland right now. Assessments of children who are culturally diverse. This is kind of what I was touching on a little bit earlier about one of the students. Assess language proficiency in both the first and the second languages when determining a culturally and linguistically different child's communication competence. Do not diagnose with a speech-language disorder. Problems are observed. Assessment of basic interpersonal communication skills and cognitive, academic, language proficiency, and assessment for the purpose of identifying children with disabilities are required by IDEA to be conducted in the child's native language. So this is, again, where you need to be careful as a school district. If if there's a possibility that what's spoken in the home may not be English, you need to make sure and do your due diligence on finding that out, because yes, you would need to be tested in the native language and not in English on that point. Some of the educational approaches: you've got articulation and phonological errors, discrimination and production activities. You've got fluency disorders, which cover behavioral principles and self-monitoring. You've got voice disorders, which then use medical examination and direct vocal rehabilitation. Language disorders, which include interventions. And you need to know this last one: augmentative and alternative communication. That may involve a diverse set of strategies and methods along with it. So definitely want to look in your book, get a little more information, make sure you understand that augmentative and alternative communication part and what they do and what some approaches are under that. The augmentative and alternative communication, or ACC, set of strategies and methods to assist individuals who cannot meet their communication needs through speech or writing. ACC entails 3 aided or unaided components. One of them is a representational symbol set or vocabulary. One is a means for selecting the symbols, and the third one a means for transmitting the symbols. And so look in your book, read about augmentative and alternative communication devices. Let's see here. The last question that I want you to take, so get a piece of paper. What are the basic goals of effective interventions for speech sound errors and then also language disorder? So go ahead and pause and answer that question. What are the basic goals of effective interventions for speech sound errors and also language disorder? The answers that I want you to look at: to teach children to communicate with a variety of other individuals and across a variety of circumstances. Children need to be around children and adults with something interesting to talk about, and language is an interactive interpersonal. Who are around them, what type of words are being stated, how many, and things like that when you're looking at these two. Placement options. In 2011-2012, 87% with speech or language were served in general ed classrooms. So these students typically are going to be students that will stay with you in the class and then be pulled for where they would go maybe 30 minutes twice a week to go to the speech and language pathologist to work on some of these strategies to help them in whatever area they're having difficulty in. 6% are in resource rooms and 4% are in separate classrooms. And you do need to look at these delivery methods. You will want to know pretty detailed information about the following items. So I would highlight these and look them up in your book, maybe write them a few times. Monitoring, there's pull out, There's collaborative consultation, classroom or curriculum based, and also separate classroom, community based, and then some combinations of the above. But definitely want to go in your book. I'd write these down on a piece of paper, write down what they are, what kinds of things are involved with them, so you can get a good understanding of what each one is like seen on a test. Lastly, and it will take a little while, I want to go over the DESE qualifications for the items in speech and language or communications. And the thing is, there are 4 of them, so we're going to go through the 4 here and go from there. The first one we're going to look at, let me go ahead and, I'm going to get a couple of these loaded up so that we can go through some. They're spinning a lot. While it's going on there, I suggest, if you haven't already, I suggested last week to get the study guide for chapter 6, 7, 8, and 14 printed off, so that as you're going through the chapters, you can write down some of those answers to help you as you get closer to studying for the test on that one there. Also, if you haven't already, go ahead and email me where you're doing what school you're going to, the teacher you're going to, whether regular ed, special ed, all of that information. Email that to me ASAP, because I want to make sure that you all are getting done what you need to get done. Okay, it looks like they've loaded up, so let's go ahead and go through these here. You have language impairment. For language impairment, you have a couple pages. First of all, the evaluation report documents the consistent, inappropriate use of one or more of the following structures of language. And these should sound familiar to you. Morphology, the structuring words from smaller units of meaning. Syntax, which is putting words together in phrases and sentences, sometimes referred to as a grammar deficit. Semantics, which selecting words to represent intended meaning and combining words and sentences to represent intended meaning, sometimes referred to as vocabulary deficits. And lastly, pragmatics, using the functions of language to communicate with others. One or more of the following. In 1500.20, the assessment of language structures, the evaluation report documents that one or more of the following procedures were used to assess the structure of language. So one or more. Language sample, which is a method of elicitation of the sample, setting for the sample, analysis procedures used, and description of the child's language deficits identified by the sample. Or structured clinical tasks like language activity initiated, setting for the clinical task, analysis of procedures used, and description of the child's language deficits defined by clinical tasks. And then there's also in the evaluation report a level of language functioning, 1500.30, and the evaluation report documents the results of 2 norm reference and standardized language assessments, which measure the same areas of language. And the second one, the evaluation determines whether the child's language functioning is significantly below the child's cognitive ability. And the following criteria apply. You've got children 3 to 5, not kindergarten eligible, with 2 standard deviations below the peers, or children who are kindergarten age and older, 1.5 standard deviations below cognitive ability, or use professional judgment with sufficient data present in the evaluation report to document the existence of a language disorder, even though criterion defined in 1500.30 and 1500.30b has not been met. Note, if unable to obtain the child's full scale cognitive scores and information that addresses the extent to which a child's language functioning adversely affects the child's educational performance, that should start sounding familiar. It is pretty much on every eligibility criteria. Specific areas of impact are described, so you need to describe which speech or language component, or how many, or whichever ones below, what they are. And the evaluation report documents is not the result of dialectal differences or second language influence. So that's language disorder. Now let's look at the next one. sound system disorder. This was updated in 2017. The evaluation report describes the child's sound production errors. These errors may be described as delay in a correct sound system production in one or more of the following, so it doesn't have to be all of them. Single sound errors might be substitutions, omissions, distortions, or additions. That should sound pretty familiar. We went right through that earlier. Multiple errors could be phonological patterns. The evaluation report documents the extent to which the child's sound production is outside the limits of state-designated normative area. And then also, it's got the evaluation production errors identified using a single word test and or sentence phrase repetition or connected speech sample, and speech sampling procedure that documents the following: the method of elicitation, setting, the activity, analysis procedures used. This should sound very familiar. Identification of sound errors and the degree of intelligibility and or impact on listener perception. Present in the evaluation report to document the existence of a disorder due to multiple errors in the sound system, which compromise child's intelligibility and the listener's perception. So again, you're looking at intelligibility and perception. And the evaluation report addresses the adverse educational impact. Again, you should start getting the hang of that one there. And the evaluation report documents the team's conclusion that the child's sound system disorder is not the result of dialectal differences or second language influences. The next one. Talked about that one. And speech fluency, and then we have speech voice. Speech fluency. A comprehensive evaluation report is present, which documents that the child consistently exhibits one or more of the following deficits or behaviors. 1. Sound, syllable, and word repetitions, prolongation of sound, syllables, or words, blockages, or hesitation. And these associated symptoms or gesturing and or extraneous facial or body activity related to the fluency may also be evident and addressed in the report. The second one's a speech sample. The evaluation report documents a sample of a child's speech in a variety of contexts. Report addresses the following: the method of elicitation, settings, analysis, and description of disfluency. And then the last few. Evaluation report documents child's fluency is significantly below the norm in one or more of the following ways. It talks about the 5 disfluencies per minute in each context, or disfluency rate of 10% or greater. And then there's an or. Sufficient data is present in the evaluation report to document through formal and informal assessments the existence of a fluency deficit when the criteria outlined and indicator met. The evaluation report includes information addressing the extent to which this fluency adversely affects the child's educational performance. So again, some similar things there. And lastly, we've got speech voice. Speech voice, the evaluation report documents the child exhibits deviations in one or more of the parameters of voice. Maybe pitch, which may be shrill or guttural. Quality, it may be breathy, horsey, or grave. Volume, it may be soft, loud, nasal, or denasal. Concern in one or more parameters of voice could indicate the need for medical referral to obtain a comprehensive voice evaluation by a qualified otolaryngologist with ear, nose, and throat specialist. A medical report may be attached. Now, I have not seen very many speech voice, but I wanted to make sure you know what is there. The evaluation report describes when the child's voice is discrepant from the expected parameters for children of same sex. The evaluation report documents that the child's voice disorder adversely affects child's educational performance. And the evaluation report documents child's voice disorder is not the result of any temporary conditions, normal voice changes, allergies, colds, or other conditions. And an explanation is provided of any known condition that may temporarily impact the child's voice disorder. So that gives you an idea. That is on the last slide, so you can go to it if you want. And make sure you get started on studying for the test. There is no discussion board for Chapter 8. So good luck. Thank you very much.